The intelligence summary arrived on Velkari Shan's datapad at 0317, station time, and she read it the way she read everything that came from the Strategic Analysis Directorate, with the patient skepticism of someone who had been burned before by data that looked clean on the surface and turned out to be catastrophically wrong underneath. The summary was titled, Comprehensive Weakness Profile, Homo sapiens, Combat Designation, and it ran to 47 pages, cross-referenced against 11 years of field observation, prisoner intake assessments, and post-engagement behavioral analysis. The Varaxian Research Collective had spent more resources compiling that document than they had spent on their last 3 military campaigns combined. Velkari read it twice. She bookmarked 4 sections. She set it down on the conference table next to her cold cup of nutrient broth and looked at the human sitting across from her. The human was looking at the window, not at Velkari, not at the data pads arranged between them, not at the sealed summary she had not yet been told existed. Just the window, which looked out on the docking arm of Terran Station's 4th ring, where 2 supply haulers were being unloaded by cargo handlers whose silhouettes moved in the amber work lighting like slow-motion chess pieces. The human watched them with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who found loading operations genuinely interesting, or who was very practiced at appearing calm, and Velkari had not yet been able to determine which explanation was correct. Her name was Corporal Nadia Vasek, 29 years old according to the intake record. Brown hair pulled into a knot at the back of her neck. Not quite regulation tightness, with a few strands loose against her collar. Lean, not large, no visible injuries from the incident at Keller's Rock 12 days ago, which was itself something Velkari's 4 eyes kept returning to as a data point worth examining, because the medical assessment filed with the after-action report had listed 4 distinct trauma indicators as expected outcomes for any personnel involved in the engagement at the levels described, and Vasek had presented at the post-mission intake screening without any of them. The attending medical officer, a Kaldrathi physician named Tovrak, had added a personal notation to the file that read simply, Human, adjusted expectations accordingly. Velkari had read that notation 3 times and was not certain whether it was clinical commentary or something closer to awe. She wore the gray field uniform of the Human Galactic Forces, 3rd Marine Expeditionary, with no unit patch on the left shoulder. That patch had been removed, the record noted, pending the outcome of this review. The uniform had been recently cleaned, but not recently issued. The fabric had the slightly altered quality of cloth that had been laundered many times in field conditions, and the cuffs showed the microscopic fraying that Velkari's species behavior training had taught her to associate with extended active deployment. There was a faint pale scar along her jaw that the intake record attributed to a training accident 4 years prior. There was another scar on the back of her right hand, a thin, curved line that the record did not explain. Velkari had noted it the moment Vasek sat down. She had not yet asked about it. The conference room on Terran Station's administrative level smelled of the station's recycled air and something faintly chemical, the cleaning compound the Kaldrathi maintenance crew used on the tables each morning, a smell Velkari associated with bureaucratic unpleasantness and correctly attributed encounters. The overhead lighting was neutral white. The seating had been calibrated for multi-species occupancy, so both Velkari's low-slung quadrupedal chair and Vasek's standard biped seat were equally functional, which meant both were equally slightly wrong. Velkari had been sitting in this room for 90 minutes before Vasek arrived, and her lower joints were already registering mild complaint. She picked up her datapad again. The Varaxian summary had been compiled, she reminded herself, by analysts who had spent 11 years studying human behavior in combat situations. 11 years of signals intelligence, intercepted communications, retrieved combat logs, and, in 8 documented cases, recovered human military personnel who had consented to debrief as part of prisoner exchange protocols. The summary had been written by beings who were not in any way amateurs. It cited sources. It showed its math. It had been reviewed by a panel of 17 species behavior specialists before the Directorate stamped it and sent it across the Alliance network to every command post within routing distance of active human deployment zones. The summary's central finding was that humans were, as a combat species, fundamentally constrained by 3 critical weaknesses: physical fragility, relative to species of comparable mass; emotional susceptibility, under sustained stress; and an inability to maintain rational decision-making architecture when confronted with casualties among proximate social bonds. The summary was careful to note that humans compensated for these weaknesses through certain forms of tactical improvisation and a puzzling willingness to absorb personal injury. But the overall assessment placed human combat personnel in the 3rd tier of galactic military effectiveness, roughly comparable to the Dolvary Compact's infantry auxiliaries, capable of holding ground under supervision, but unsuited for independent high-stakes operations. The physical fragility section had been, in Valkyrie's reading, the most defensible. She had seen the comparative mass assessments, the bone density figures, the injury per contact statistics from 14 different engagement types. Humans were not armored in the way that Kaldrathi line soldiers were armored, not braced in the way that Vraxian heavy infantry were braced. In a straightforward measurement of tissue durability, the numbers were accurate. What the section did not address, and what Valkyrie had noted in the margin of her second reading, was why a species with those fragility metrics continued to show up to engagements that other species with superior physical profiles declined. The summary did not find that question interesting. She was increasingly certain it should have. Valkyrie had read those findings with the summary in hand in the human 3 meters away from her, and she had experienced a sensation she later identified as the specific intellectual discomfort of 2 incompatible datasets occupying the same moment. The summary said one thing. The incident record from Keller's Rock said something quite different. Her assignment, as Special Review Investigator for the Joint Alliance Military Conduct Panel, was to reconcile them. She set the data pad face down, a deliberate choice she had learned from her mentor in the Directorate 20 years ago. Face down meant she was done consulting documents for the moment. It was a signal humans did not necessarily recognize, but signals mattered even when their recipient missed them. They mattered for the sender. "Corporal Vasek," she said. Vasek turned from the window without hurry. Her eyes settled on Valkyrie with a directness that the Vraxian summary, in a section Valkyrie had bookmarked, described as a dominance display common to primate-descended species and advised against interpreting as aggressive. The section had recommended that alien investigators maintain a forward-facing posture during human eye contact to avoid triggering territorial responses. Valkyrie had read that section and then found herself wondering whether the authors had ever actually sat in a room with a human before they wrote it. "Investigator Sean," Vasek said. Her translator rendered the words in clean Standard Galactic. Flat affect. No particular inflection on Valkyrie's name. Not disrespectful. Not warm. Factual. The way a specification sheet was factual. "I want to begin with the Keller's Rock engagement," Valkyrie said. "Specifically with the 72 hours before the Vraxian ground forces withdrawal." Vasek nodded once. "The after-action report filed by Commander Ostova lists your unit, 3rd Platoon Bravo, as the last human element to disengage from the colony perimeter." Valkyrie pulled the datapad face up again, found the relevant line. At the time of disengagement, your platoon had been at the perimeter for 61 hours of continuous contact. 63, Vasek said. Velkari's secondary eyelids flickered, a reflex she didn't try to suppress. The report says 61. Commander Ostova wasn't at the southern trench between hours 61 and 63. We were. Vasek did not say this with any particular heat. She said it the way someone corrects a wrong number on an invoice. 63 hours. Velkari made a notation. The summary had described human soldiers as prone to exaggeration under stress, a tendency toward narrative inflation when recounting personal performance. She wrote down 63 and bracketed it with a question mark, then decided the question mark was unwarranted and removed it. The woman across from her did not have the presentation of someone who was inflating anything. During those 63 hours, Velkari continued, your platoon sustained casualties. Yes. The record lists 14 personnel at the start of contact. She waited. 14, Vasek confirmed. And at disengagement. A pause. Not long. 2 seconds, perhaps 3, that cost Vasek something Velkari watched her pay without complaint. 7, she said. The number landed in the room like a dropped instrument. Velkari kept her secondary eyelids still. 7 out of 14. Half a platoon, across 63 hours, holding a perimeter that the Varaxian relief force had assessed as untenable and recommended abandoning in the operational planning stage before the first shot was fired. The recommendation had been overruled by the colony's civilian administrator, a Telvari named Grosk, who had 416 non-combatant residents in the settlement who could not be evacuated in time. Those 416 were alive and had been evacuated to the RSS Valiant Storm the morning of the withdrawal, because 3rd Platoon Bravo had stayed on the southern trench. The Varaxian summary's third critical weakness, the one about emotional susceptibility and the inability to maintain rational decision-making when facing casualties among proximate social bonds, sat in Velkari's memory and offered no useful comment on any of this. 7, she said aloud, to confirm the number, and found that she was doing it not as a procedural step, but because the room seemed to require the number be stated rather than merely understood. 7, Vasek said again. No variation in her tone. She was not about to cry. She was not performing composure. She was simply composed in the same way the station's structural supports were composed, because that was what they were built to do. Velkari spent 12 seconds looking at the data pad without reading it, which she recognized as an inefficiency, and corrected. The conduct panel has flagged 3 items from your unit's performance record for review, she said. The first is the use of a non-standard engagement protocol in the final 14 hours of contact, specifically the deployment of 3 personnel in an isolated forward position without direct communication to the primary defense line. Vasek looked at her without changing her expression. The protocol is listed in the Joint Alliance Manual of Military Conduct as a restricted tactic, requiring commander-level authorization for units below company strength. I know what it's listed as, Vasek said. Your platoon was below company strength. My platoon was 7 people by that point. A pause shorter than the previous one. 6 during the forward deployment. Corporal Ewan stayed back with the wounded. Velkari registered the correction without making it visible. The forward element had been 3 personnel from a total remaining effective force of 6, not 7, which changed the calculus of the tactic from reckless to calculated. 3 of 6, not 3 of 7. The distinction was 2 percentage points in raw numbers and a significant distance in what it implied about the person who had made the call. The 3 personnel in the forward position, she said, their purpose. They drew fire from the eastern ridge for 40 minutes, Vasek said. The main Vraxian assault element had a fire support team positioned there that was emplacing a crew-served weapon. The weapon, once emplaced, had a direct line of sight on the colony's water processing structure. The processing structure was also the evacuation shelter for 212 civilians. She paused. The fire support team was distracted by the forward element. The crew-served weapon was not emplaced. The processing structure remained intact. There was a long moment in which the conference room's ventilation system made a low, cycling sound that Velkari had stopped noticing 90 minutes ago and was noticing again now. The 3 personnel in the forward position, Velkari said carefully. Came back, Vasek said. The flatness in her voice had something underneath it now, something compressed and load-bearing, but she did not let it into her speech. All 3 came back. Velkari turned to the second flagged item without transition, which was itself a kind of mercy she offered the conversation without announcing it. The second item is a communications record, she said. At hour 48, you sent a transmission on the colony's civilian frequency rather than the military channel. The military channel was being jammed. The civilian frequency was not encrypted. No, Vasek agreed. The message was not sensitive. It was a logistics request. A request for food, Velkari said, checking the record. And water. The platoon's resupply had not reached us since hour 22. We had exhausted personal carry. She looked at Velkari with that same direct attention. The colony's emergency stores responded. Grosk sent 3 of his people through the maintenance tunnels with 17 liters of water and 9 meal packs. That was the resupply for 14 people. She corrected herself. For the 9 people still mobile at that point. Velkari did not say anything immediately. She was reading the section of the summary about emotional susceptibility and the reasoning it had used to conclude that human soldiers became unreliable under extended physical deprivation. The section cited 6 documented cases in which human units had degraded in performance after 48 hours without adequate nutrition. The section did not cite any cases, and the datapad did not find any when she searched, in which a human unit had continued operational effectiveness for 63 hours on 17 liters of water and 9 meal packs shared among 9 people, and had done so while managing a perimeter, conducting an improvised forward engagement action, and bringing all 3 of those personnel back afterward. She was going to need a different section of the summary. She was not certain any of the sections she had bookmarked were going to be adequate. The third flagged item was the one she had been building toward, and she suspected Vasek knew it, because Vasek had been looking at her with the quality of attention that suggested she was waiting for it. The third item, Velkari said, is a record of communication between you and Commander Korvath of the Vraxian 3rd Expeditionary, transmitted at hour 57 over the open emergency channel. Vasek waited. Commander Korvath communicated at that time to advise that Vraxian forces were preparing to withdraw from the Keller's rock system, Velkari said. He indicated that the operational assessment had concluded the colony was not defensible. He requested your unit's coordinates for evacuation extraction. He requested our coordinates, Vasek said, so he knew where not to go. Velkari's skin shifted, a pale ripple along her upper dermis that she could not control and did not try to. The record indicates the Vraxian relief force withdrew without collecting 3rd Platoon Bravo or the wounded personnel under your care. Yes. And you remained. We remained, Vasek said. We had wounded who couldn't move, a perimeter that was currently holding, and 416 people in a shelter 60 meters behind us. Leaving them wasn't a calculation we were going to make. The summary, Velkari thought, had characterized this pattern of behavior as a dysfunction. The specific word used was dysfunction, in a section that argued human soldiers became irrationally attached to defense of proximate non-combatants in ways that compromised tactical flexibility. The authors had meant it as a liability. She was looking at Nadia Vasek across a conference table on Terran Station, reading that section in her memory, and finding that the word dysfunction had stopped meaning what the summary had intended it to mean. "I want to understand something," Velkari said, and she was aware that she had shifted registers slightly away from the procedural cadence of an investigative review and towards something that felt more like a conversation between two people trying to work out a complicated fact together. "The Vraxian summary I'm consulting in this investigation assessed your species' combat effectiveness at 3rd tier. The specific language describes humans as, quote, unsuited for independent high-stakes operations due to structural psychological constraints." Vasek said nothing. She was listening. "The evidence from Keller's Rock, which I am now reading against that assessment, is not consistent with it. I need you to help me understand the discrepancy." The corner of Vasek's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The summary section on human facial expression had devoted 2 pages to the ambiguity of the human mouth as a signal display, and Velkari, reading that section in her first pass, had found it overcomplicated. Looking at Vasek's face now, she thought the summary might have been right about at least one thing. "What specifically did the summary say about emotional susceptibility?" Vasek asked. Velkari looked at her datapad. She read the relevant passage aloud, in translation. It took 37 seconds. When she finished, Vasek's expression had not changed, but something behind it had settled into a different position, the way weight shifts when it finds its proper resting place. "They got the mechanism right," Vasek said, "and the direction exactly backwards." Velkari waited. "We do form strong attachments to the people around us, to the people we're protecting." Vasek set her forearms on the table, a posture that the summary had indexed as non-aggressive self-disclosure, which Velkari thought was a way of saying a person was being honest. "That isn't a constraint. It's why we don't quit. The Vraxians modeled it as a failure mode because they were looking at it from the outside and seeing the cost." She paused. "From the inside, the cost is the point. You carry the cost because the alternative is not carrying it, and the alternative means those 416 people die in a colony shelter while you fly away in an evacuation shuttle." Velkari's secondary eyelids closed and opened again. "You are describing a willingness to die for strangers." "I'm describing a willingness to do the job," Vasek said. "The dying part isn't the preference. It's the acceptable outcome when the other outcomes are worse." She looked at the table surface for a moment, and then there was something in that brief downward glance that was the closest she had come to showing anything personal. A weight she carried, at a depth below the flat professional register, real and carefully managed. Davies understood that. So did Okoye and Marchetti and the other 4. They all understood it. That's why they stayed, not because they were ordered to. She looked back up. "Korvath issued the evacuation order to our frequency. Technically, we were released from the engagement obligation." She paused. Nobody moved. The room absorbed that in silence. Velkari said, after a moment, "The Vraxian withdrawal was their call to make," Vasek said, and she said it without bitterness, which made it more unsettling than bitterness would have been. "They assessed and they withdrew. That's a legitimate command decision given the information they had." A pause that was not quite a pause, more the length of time it takes to choose which sentence comes next. The information they had was built on a model that told them we would also withdraw. We did not because we had different information. We had the Rel family 60 meters behind us. There was a Kaldrathi behavioral theorist, a scholar commander named Avrix, who had written at length about the concept of species-level sacrifice calculus, the evolutionary and social mechanisms by which a civilization determined what costs its members would voluntarily accept in defense of the collective. Velkari had read Avrix's work in her training. Avrix had concluded, after analyzing 47 spacefaring species, that the species most willing to accept personal destruction in defense of strangers were, statistically, the most stable long-term partners in any military alliance. They were also, he had noted in a footnote, that subsequent generations of analysts had somewhat wished he had buried deeper in the text, the most difficult to fight if you ended up on the wrong side of them. Velkari had highlighted that footnote 18 months ago in a different context, about a different species. She found herself thinking about it now. The Varaxian analysts who compiled the weakness profile, she said, had access to field data from 11 years of contact with human military personnel. I know they did, Vasek said. What do you think they were looking for? Vasek tilted her head, a small angle. What do you think they needed to find? She said. It was not an evasion. It was a clarifying question, a redirect that revealed the shape of the original question more clearly than the original question had managed. The answer, when Velkari arrived at it 30 seconds later and found it sitting in her chest with the comfortable solidity of a thing that had been true the whole time, was that the Vraxian Strategic Analysis Directorate had wanted a document that confirmed their operational assessment. They had needed humans to be third tier because their operational plans for the Keller's rock system had been built on the assumption that human forces would withdraw when withdrawal became tactically sensible. And if that assumption was wrong, then 6 other assumptions downstream of it were also wrong. And their entire model of the engagement window had been built on a foundation that did not exist. They were looking, Velkari said slowly, for evidence that their model was correct. They found evidence that fit the model, Vasek said. The cases they cited, the 6 documented degradation instances, those were real. We have soldiers who break. We have units that fail under extended deprivation. She looked at the window again for a moment, at the loading arm and its amber lights. We also have soldiers who don't. The summary didn't distinguish between them. Because the distinction wasn't useful to the model, Velkari said. Because the distinction would have required them to explain what makes the difference, Vasek said. And that answer gets complicated fast. Velkari set her datapad down, face down. Tell me what makes the difference. The ventilation cycled. Outside the window, a cargo hauler completed its docking approach, and its running lights went amber to green as the lock engaged. Vasek watched it for a moment, a reflex, and then turned back to Velkari with the expression of someone who has been asked to give directions through terrain they know very well but have never had to explain in words. The Vraxian model assumes soldiers degrade under the same conditions regardless of what they're defending, she said. A position, a strategic objective, a resource node. And that's accurate for a lot of engagement types. Extended static defense of a high-value military installation, you're going to see degradation curves that look exactly like what the summary describes. She folded her hands on the table, a gesture her translator tag didn't try to index. Keller's Rock wasn't a military installation. It was 416 people, most of them Telvari, a few Kaldrathi. A couple of Vraxian agricultural workers who hadn't evacuated. She paused. 3 of them were families with children. I didn't know their names. Grusk brought the water, and he told me about them during the handoff in the tunnel because he needed to tell someone, and I was the person available. Velkari found she was very still. One of the families, Vasek said, and she said it in the same declarative register as everything else, which somehow made it carry more weight than any inflection would have, was sheltering in the water processing structure directly behind the southern trench. The one the crew-served weapon would have targeted if the fire support team had been allowed to complete their emplacement. She looked at her folded hands. The family's surname was Rel, Telvari. The 2 children were 4 and 7 standard years old. The Vraxian summary had contained in its appendix a table of human psychological responses to information about civilian casualties. The table had been built from post-engagement debriefs and had concluded that exposure to civilian casualty information increased human combatant stress levels in ways that degraded performance. Velkari looked at Vasek's face and thought the table had measured the right response and drawn the wrong conclusion, the way you can correctly observe water flowing downhill and incorrectly conclude the landscape is broken. You do not degrade the same way, Vasek said, when you know their names, or when you've been told about them, or when the alternative is watching them die while you fly away in a shuttle. The Vraxian analysts would argue, Velkari said carefully, that this is exactly the vulnerability they identified, that the emotional load you're describing impairs objective tactical assessment. Vasek looked at her for a moment. Ask me what the objective was. Velkari waited. The objective, Vasek said, was to get 416 people off that colony alive. That was the mission. Not the strategic resource node, not the orbital approach corridor, not the supply depot on the eastern ridge. The people. She unfolded her hands and set them flat on the table. We didn't have an impaired assessment of the objective. We had a clearer one than anyone else in the operational chain. That's why we stayed when the assessment came down that the position wasn't defensible. The position was defensible enough for long enough if you were willing to be the ones doing the defending. The institutional framing of the review, Velkari noted, had just become insufficient. She was not conducting a misconduct investigation anymore. She was conducting something that felt more like a species assessment, and she had not brought the right questions for it, because the questions she had brought had been written by people who had read the summary and believed its conclusions. She stood, which for her species involved a short reorganization of weight across 4 limbs. Vasek did not stand. She watched Velkari with the same patient attention she had given the cargo hauler. I need to suspend this session briefly, Velkari said. I need to consult with the conduct panel's full membership. Vasek nodded. There is a waiting area off the corridor outside. It has a window facing the station's outer ring. I saw it on the way in, Vasek said. Velkari moved toward the door, then stopped. The question had been forming for the last 20 minutes, and she had been holding it back as procedurally off-topic. It was still procedurally off-topic. She asked it anyway. The scar on your hand, the curved one. The intake record doesn't explain it. Vasek looked at her right hand, turned it slightly. Old one, she said, from before I enlisted. Velkari waited. I was a labor mediator in Detroit for 3 years. Disputes between manufacturing workers and facility owners. Sometimes the disputes got physical before the mediation started. She looked at the scar the way someone looks at a reminder they've decided to keep. It's from a chain-link fence, 6 floors up, trying to prevent a man from jumping. A pause so brief, it almost didn't exist. He didn't jump. Velkari processed this for 2 seconds longer than she intended to. Then she went out the door. The conduct panel convened in the smaller briefing room 2 corridors down. 3 members had attended the original session briefing that morning. Sub-Commander Draxus of the Kaldrathi Accord, who had the physical presence of something designed specifically to fill a room, and who had expressed in the pre-session consult a skepticism about the entire review process that he had not bothered to disguise. Analyst Prime Sev of the Solvathi Scientific Cooperative, who had been brought in specifically because the cooperative had contributed to the original Vraxian weakness summary and needed representation during any evidence review that touched it. And Fleet Coordinator Macht of the Raxian Naval Authority, who was small even by Raxian standards, and had the quality of noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing, which Velkari had found useful in past joint reviews. She laid out the Keller's rock record. She read the key numbers: 63 hours, 14 to 7, 416 survivors, 3 forward deployment personnel returned. She set the Varaxian summary next to the evidence without editorial comment and let them read the gap between the 2 documents for themselves. It took Draxus 4 minutes to work through the relevant sections. It took Sieve 7 because Sieve read with his head tendrils active, which meant he was cross-indexing against memory stores as he went, a habit that was slow and almost always resulted in correct conclusions. Macht read both documents in approximately 3 minutes, put them both down, and stared at the middle distance with the expression Velkari associated with a person who had already arrived at the conclusion and was now deciding how to manage the conversation that would take everyone else there. Draxus spoke first. "The summary's deprivation-degradation model," he said, tapping the data pad with one broad claw. 9 meal packs, 17 liters, for 9 people. Over 39 hours. 42 hours from the last resupply to the end of contact, Velkari corrected. Draxus made a sound that Velkari's translator declined to index. He set the data pad down and looked at the far wall. "The Kaldrathi standard for sustained operations resupply," Velkari said, because the room needed the comparison spoken aloud, "is a minimum of 4.7 liters of hydration per soldier per 24-hour period, with caloric supplementation at 6-hour intervals." "Yes," Draxus said, in a tone that meant he had already done the math and did not particularly want to say the number out loud. Siev's head tendrils had gone very still, which for Solvathi indicated a specific kind of processing that preceded significant position revision. The cooperative's contribution to the summary was primarily the section on social bond disruption, he said carefully. The conclusion that casualty events among proximate unit members would produce decision-making degradation. "Yes," Velkari said, "and the Keller's rock record shows 7 casualties within the platoon's immediate unit bond structure," Siev said, "which, by our model, should have produced significant impairment in the remaining 7 personnel." "It should have," Velkari agreed. "The forward deployment action was conducted at hour 51, Siev said, after 6 casualties had already occurred." "Yes." The head tendrils moved again, slowly, in the pattern Velkari associated with a conclusion the speaker was not entirely comfortable with. "The model assumes degradation is proportional to bond loss," Siev said. "The Keller's rock data suggests the relationship may be inverted under certain conditions." Macht had not spoken. He was looking at the record of Vasek's transmission on the civilian frequency, the one requesting food and water, and the response from Grosk's people in the maintenance tunnels. He looked up. "What were the names?" he said. Velkari looked at him. "The 3 families with children," Macht said. "Did the corporal tell you their names?" "She said she didn't know their names at the time," Velkari said. "Grosk told her about them during the water handoff." Macht set down the datapad with the particular deliberateness of someone filing a conclusion rather than a document. The Vraxian model, he said, was built on the assumption that human soldiers are fighting for the military objective, the same as any other species, and that social bond disruption compromises the objective calculus. He looked around the table. That assumption may not be accurate. Draxus turned back from the far wall. He had the look, Velkari thought, of a large animal that had been moving in one direction for a long time and was recalibrating its heading, which was not a comfortable process for large animals. If the assumption is not accurate, he said, then the entire Vraxian operational framework for Keller's Rock was built on a falsehood. Yes, Velkari said. And the recommendation to withdraw the relief force, which Korvath acted on, which left 3rd Platoon Bravo without extraction and without resupply for 42 hours. Yes, Velkari said again. Siv folded his secondary appendages against his torso, a gesture that in Solvati convention indicated formal acknowledgement of a finding one had helped create and now found indefensible. It was, Velkari knew, the closest he would come to saying the cooperative had gotten it wrong. It would have to be enough. The room was quiet for long enough that the station's ventilation cycle completed and started again. What are we reviewing? Draxus said, and his voice had shifted into a register Velkari had only heard from him twice before, once after a tribunal that had produced findings he had not expected, and once after a campaign debriefing that had required his command to revise 3 years of strategic planning. Are we reviewing the corporal's conduct, or are we reviewing the summary? We are reviewing the corporal's conduct, Velkari said. The summary is a separate matter. Is it? Macht said in a tone that meant he knew the answer. The conduct panel's findings, when Velkari returned to the conference room with them 90 minutes later, were brief. The 3 flagged items were individually reviewed and individually cleared. The forward deployment tactic was classified as a valid command decision under the emergency provisions of the Joint Alliance Manual, Section 12, Paragraph 4, which allowed deviation from standard protocols when the alternative was material civilian harm. The civilian frequency communication was noted as a creative logistic solution under adverse conditions and appended to the manual's supplementary guidance section, which was something that happened approximately twice in a standard decade. The decision to remain at the perimeter after the Vraxian withdrawal was struck from the conduct review entirely, reclassified from a potential rules violation to a documented example of operational commitment to civilian protection mandate, and forwarded to the Human Galactic Force's 3rd Marine Expeditionary for notation in Vasek's service record. Velkari read the findings aloud. Vasek listened without changing her expression, the same flat, factual attention she had given everything else. At the end, there was a formal statement to be read, a standard close of review address that Velkari had delivered dozens of times. She read the first sentence, then set the data pad down, face down. The Vraxian summary, she said. It will be flagged for comprehensive reevaluation by the Directorate. The Solvati Cooperative has agreed to participate in the reevaluation. The findings from this review will be attached as primary evidentiary contradiction. She paused. I am telling you this because you should know it happened. Vasek looked at her. That quality of attention, the same one she'd given the cargo hauler, the loading lights, the maintenance tunnel, and the water packs, and 6 losses in 63 hours. The people writing the next summary, Vasek said. Are they going to fix the model? Or are they going to work backwards from whatever conclusion they need? Velkari thought about 11 years of data assembled by analysts who had needed it to say something specific. She thought about Avrix's footnote and the particular discomfort of footnotes that became more accurate the longer you sat with them. She thought about a labor mediator from Detroit, 3 years trying to prevent people from jumping, and a chain-link fence 6 floors up, and a scar she had kept. That, she said carefully, is an excellent question. Vasek stood. She collected nothing, because she had arrived with nothing. She set her chair back under the table with the precise mechanical consideration of someone who had learned the habit in places where you left things exactly as you found them, so the person behind you had the same chance you had. At the door she stopped, turned. Not fully, just enough. If the next engagement has another Keller's Rock, she said, you're going to want to think very carefully about what your operational planners assume about us. She said it the same way she had said everything else, the same flat declarative register, and Vilkari could not tell if it was a reassurance or a warning, and she suspected that was entirely intentional. Then, she was in the corridor, and the door closed, and the conference room on Terran Station's administrative level was very quiet, and smelled of cleaning compound and recycled air, and the faint cold residue of a conversation that had started as a review of misconduct and ended as something Vilkari was going to be thinking about for a long time. She looked at the Vraxian summary on her datapad. 47 pages, 11 years of analysis, 17 species behavior specialists. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a map. When you are standing in terrain, the map describes as flat. Outside the window, the cargo hauler's running lights had gone from amber to the standard white of a vessel cleared for transit. It began its slow pull away from the docking arm, navigation lights blinking patient and unhurried in the dark. Vilkari picked up her cold cup of nutrient broth, found it was still cold, and drank it anyway.